Welcome to Season 5 of the Manufacturers Network. Real talk with the people building what's next in manufacturing. And now your host, Lisa Ryan.
Hey, it's Lisa Ryan. Welcome to the Manufacturers Network podcast. I'm excited to introduce our guest today, Bruce Vojak. Bruce is a leading authority on strategic innovation, possessing a unique and proven combination of multiply deep and broad experience. A business advisor, board member, senior fellow with the Conference Board, and author of 2 highly regarded books on innovation, published by Stanford University Press, he helps mature companies in mature industries survive and thrive in a volatile, complex, and increasingly ambiguous world. So, Bruce, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Share with us a little bit about your background and what led you to doing what you do.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for asking. I often tell people that I'm an engineer by nature and education, and I'm a techie at heart, going back to my early days. And maybe the first quarter of my career, I was deeply in the lab, deeply looking at those issues, and began to gradually look into issues of how did that technology influence and impact business. And so along the way, picked up an MBA, began to take on more managerial and executive roles. And throughout that whole time, I began to notice people who were really amazing, remarkable innovators. And they were people. It wasn't the processes, it was the people. It wasn't necessarily the culture, it was the people. And I had this kind of nagging question of how do they know what to do? And that led me into a string of research projects while I was at the University of Illinois, published a book on innovation with 2 great co-authors, and have continued to explore that question of the people who innovate and how they do it. And just to give you a little bit of context, I work with mature companies in mature industries. So manufacturing companies are a great audience for the kinds of things that I look at.
So there's often some confusion or uncertainty when it constitutes innovation. So when you say that, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking. A lot of people conflate innovation with creativity and something being very new. And I'd say while innovation is that way, that's not a very good definition, because it really has to be something that has a financial impact, that has an impact in the marketplace that people want to spend money on. So the first order definition to me is something that the market really wants, and it's something new and different that the market wants. Again, for the audience that you have here, manufacturing audience, I often hear them talk about things like lean implementations and Six Sigma. I hear about implementations of physical equipment, CNC machines, and automation. These are all good things, but it rather limits the definition of innovation. And it tends to focus more on, in many cases, more on the incremental. So what I like to do when I think of innovation, I think about what are the things that change the basis of competition in an industry? What can you do to make things so sufficiently different that you have an advantage, or to see these things coming and keep from being at a disadvantage? Those are the 2 sides of the coin.
Okay. So what are some examples of innovation that you feel are changing the basis of competition?
Yeah, I'll give you maybe 2 of them just to start. And these are ones that I like to share because they're very familiar to people. If you think about peeling carrots, for example, 100 years ago, you and I would be using a knife to peel a carrot. And then eventually somebody realized that, probably somebody like me who used to cut their finger on the knife, they realized that there's probably a better way to do this. And they designed a safety peeler where the blades are now facing each other. They're on a swivel head. And you can very safely and conveniently and actually uniformly peel carrots with a safety peeler. And that product got optimized within that design concept for over many years, became a very efficient design to manufacture. But then in the 1990s, there were 2 big things that occurred. One was the introduction of the ergonomic peeler by OXO. That was a brand new concept.
Sure. Okay.
And that's a way that the competition was changed fundamentally. And then the other way was the idea of a pre-peeled carrot. Because before the pre-peeled carrot, everybody was peeling their own carrots. And what's interesting about that in particular is that carrot consumption has gone up in that time frame, because it's just been so easy for people to have these. And then real quickly, the other example I love to give is the Oakland Athletics, what used to be the Oakland A's Moneyball team, where they really reconsidered what's the nature of how you optimize a baseball team using sabermetrics and statistics rather than that gut feel, if you will. And those are ways that competition really has changed dramatically as a result of these kinds of things. And I'll just quickly add, you'll find this in every industry, but you got to start looking for it to begin to see it.
That's so interesting when you talk about the pre-peeled carrots, because you look at the difference in price between a pound of unpeeled carrots and a half a pound of baby carrots. And you know what? I'm picking the baby carrots every time.
Yeah, we do too. It's the same thing. We give them to our dogs. It's just slice them up, and it's just easier to work with, much easier to work with.
Exactly. And so sometimes it's almost like you're fixing problems that people don't think are broken. There was nothing wrong except for the blood involved with using a knife. Like I say in a lot of my programs, asking yourself questions that you didn't think you have to ask before. Is there a better way to peel carrots? So what is the baby carrots of your manufacturing organization? And just starting to figure that out.
Well, and it's a great question, Lisa. In fact, I'll just quickly insert this now, that the best innovations have been people not letting go of inhibitions, but rather deeply understanding the situation. And what you just said just really hits on that profoundly, because you don't have to be a Silicon Valley, if you will, entrepreneur to innovate. I see this constantly in very mature industries when people just put their mind to it.
Yeah. So what do you think is the greatest risk for manufacturers when it comes to innovation?
Yeah, if you think about the product life cycle and the business life cycle and an industry life cycle, you start out with the entrepreneurial activity, very fluid, and then there's rapid growth of that industry, and then it hits maturity. And I'd say most manufacturing companies are at maturity at this point. It doesn't mean that they stay stagnant. There's constant change of types of technologies they use and approaches. They do add things like we said earlier, CNC, actually for many years now, but even automation in ways that they didn't do before. So there's always, if you will, change going on at that maturity level. But many manufacturers tend to retreat to that familiar way of doing things. And they don't ask these deeper questions that we spoke about earlier. And I don't mean academically deep. It's just asking, what are my unarticulated assumptions? What are the things I'm assuming without even realizing it? And so what they tend to do is they retreat to the core business. They don't ask these other questions. And so I always tell people that I think the real risk is to not innovate. Not saying a big investment necessarily, but people who just don't even ask the right questions or don't ask questions.
Yeah. Well, I think back to when the pandemic happened with my speaking business, and I never asked myself the question, gee, I wonder what would happen if a worldwide pandemic came and shut down my business for 2 years.
Yes.
What would I do? It's the same thing. There's so many different companies, Kodak, for example, that never ask themselves the questions, gee, what happens if people don't really ever start printing out pictures again? Or for a while, there was the video television where you could call and you could talk to people on video on TV. It's now we all have one. Those companies go bust when they don't say, okay, what happens if this goes away? And then at least they have a plan B, whether or not it ever comes to fruition.
You're right about the plan B. And the way I like to look at it is, especially in manufacturing companies, a manufacturing company very often can be viewed financially as a bond and I don't want to say that there's zero risk, but compared to other industries that are more marketing focused, there's a relatively lower risk. And what you're typically doing is you're trying to remove costs from the system, whether it's by design, whether it's by material costs, whether it's by organization. And you've got that bond just paying off dividends, and it's remarkable. But there's two investments that companies often don't think about. One is, what's the role of insurance and what's the role of a financial option? And so insurance means, like you said, what happens if you get blindsided? An innovation investment, and again, I'm talking about very small investments, investment of time in some cases, is an insurance policy. And the other thing is, it's an option for future growth, because if you along the way come up with an idea that you hadn't been considering, you've got an opportunity to grow yet another business in addition to that bond that's, delivering payments every month. Not to say it's risk-free, but lower risk.
Yeah. And I think about just how fast technology is changing, how much my business has changed in the last 2 years with AI, and it just keeps going with such a lightning pace. I can't even imagine what it's going to be in 3 years from now when literally our worlds are changed. And how do we reskill the people, the good people that we have that may not have the skills right now? How do we make sure that they're prepared? And how do we make sure that our companies are prepared for this coming? You just mentioned that the real risk is not to innovate, but when you talk about all of the stuff that's happening right now and very near in the future, how are you advising companies to proceed?
Yeah, I like to this is based on just decades of what I've seen, is that there's really three issues that companies need to face when they think about innovation. And one is internal alignment, and I can expand on this a bit. The other is having some very simple processes, and especially for the small and mid-sized companies, if you will, they don't need to be very elaborate processes. And then the last thing is having what I would call innovation exemplars, or in some earlier work that I did, I referred to them as serial innovators. And this last group are the people who they see patterns that other people don't see, or they see them at least before other people see them. And if you have those three things in place or have access to them, perhaps even if you bring that in as an expert in one of these fields like AI, if you know how to evaluate those people, you're usually pretty well set.
So does somebody come to mind when you think innovation exemplar, an example of that? Is that a person or is that a thing?
It's a person. Yeah. Thanks for asking. And when I say innovation exemplar, these are people who see patterns before other people do. And they're also people not only that see the patterns, they're not just idea generators. They understand how to navigate the organization to get ideas bought in, if you will. A big failure that I saw a couple of years ago was a company hired someone who was an idea guy. And I'm sure he had a lot of great ideas, but he hadn't paved the ground, if you will, for getting that idea accepted in the organization. So these are people. And so when you asked about examples, I can give examples from the two books that I co-authored on innovation. One was a guy, Tom Osborne, unfortunately passed away now, formerly at Procter & Gamble. He was responsible for really rethinking what a feminine hygiene product looked like. And he deeply understood the need. And it's a remarkable story because it's an area where P&G at the time had a very good business in this area. And somebody who would challenge that business to create something even better is a real rare individual. Another person, I'll just use this P&G example because she comes to mind. I profiled her in the more recent book, No Excuses Innovation. Nancy Dawes, responsible for the Olay product at Procter & Gamble. And that was a declining. If you remember, my grandmother used to use oil of Olay, this little pink beauty goo, if you will. And in fact, I heard it once called oil of old lady. But Nancy, with others, but Nancy really, from the innovator perspective, really rethought what that could be and converted a declining product into a billion-dollar brand. And then again, I'm going to focus now a bit on manufacturing companies now. You look at companies that are, let's say, mid-size, and one is a company I've been on the advisory board for a while. Actually, I've been on the advisory board for the private equity group that owns them, that's JVA Partners, but the company is Westech Automation Solutions. And at the risk of maybe going into too much detail, they make automation solutions for other companies. So they solve other companies' automation problems, but they're typically were either given a design to meet or given a spec to meet. And they got called in, I don't know how many years ago now, it's probably at least 5 or 6 years, maybe more ago, by a company who said, we're not going to use those two business models. We're going to put you and a few other companies in a virtual room, and you're going to have to sort out how you'll all work together. We just want the endpoint. And very radical request. And the guys at Westech just rolled up their sleeves and just dug into it. And they now have a wonderful continuing stream of business because they took on that risk and challenge and were willing to think differently about things. And so to me, that's an example of the people. And that was not just an individual, it was a handful of people, this team, that were able and willing to take this on, and quite honestly, ownership willing to let them do that. And I've got other ones like that, but they're usually a person or sometimes two people, at times, like I just mentioned, a small team. But these are where the ideas come from, and these are the people who also implement. And it's powerful.
Yeah, it's funny. When you were talking, the thing that I was thinking was from back in the days when I had my Crackberry to having this phone without a keyboard. And we were all like, what do you mean without a keyboard? How are we ever going to live without a keyboard? But with Steve Jobs, and he's such an innovator to begin with, with the thought of creating something beautiful and sticking with it and taking the technology that was already there. It's all smart technology, but it's just gotten smarter.
And that's please go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say Steve Jobs is a wonderful example of an innovator in taking, in a real way, a lot of off-the-shelf available technology,
right,
and very much a design perspective and understanding human needs. For small and mid-sized companies, there are people, and I like to refer to them as the most important people you've never heard of. Mm-hmm. So they're not the Steve Jobs, they're not the Jeff Bezoses or the Elon Musks. They're the people, they're very often not the president or owner of the company. They're very often, not always, they can be the president or owner, but they can also be people in that organization that have these insights and make things happen. And it's finding these people and encouraging them and developing them. It's so critical for a company.
Exactly. One of the other things that you said, like simple processes I get, but what do you mean by alignment?
Yeah, in order to be successful, you heard statements like you got to get everybody on the train and put them in the right seats or the bus, the metaphor. And in a way that's a bit what I'm talking about here. There's two questions that companies need to really ask themselves. One is strategic. Are we really going to invest in innovation? And I don't mean massive investments. I'll repeat this throughout the whole time we have today. These should start out very small and be very incremental, poker-like bets. So number one is, should we even do this? And then the second question is a more tactical one of what about this specific question or problem? And I've often seen companies hung up by situations where they say they're going to invest in this, and then one person, two people, not even at the management team level, they push back in some ways and they aren't aligned. And it doesn't take much to put the brakes on these innovation processes. And sometimes it's even little things like, and I don't want to pick on the sales and marketing team, but if an engineer wants to talk to a customer to better understand their needs, if sales and marketing wants to stop that, and it's not always the case, but I've seen it happen, that lack of alignment really can inhibit opportunities for growth. And so you've got to find out how to get people on the same page. And again, it's a strategic question. Are we going to even do this? If that answer is yes, what about the specific idea? And then you got to go through and you say, can we influence these people? Can we winsomely bring them over? Do we have to deal with them in a more severe way? I've seen companies marginalize people who just won't get on board, if you will. And so it's a challenge because typically in a manufacturing company, again, not to malign it, they're so focused on this mature aspect of optimizing cost and product and systems and processes that they very often won't ask those other questions. And so how do you then fold that back into the company culture is critical.
And I think that there's two parts of that. Number one, the fear of change. We get really comfortable of doing the things that we want to do. And then on the other half of that is creating an environment that's safe enough so that when things do go wrong, you're not throwing that person under the bus, but you're learning the lesson and moving on. A lot of times in this show, we talk about workplace culture, and you have the innovators and you have the people that like everything the same. And we need to move forward without losing the people, but also getting the buy-in that we need to create that alignment to keep us moving forward and keeping our great people.
Absolutely. And it's not easy. Managing the people aspect it's a critical and at times challenging, I'll call it a problem. I hate to say that. I loved your comment about learning, because I've often heard people talk about innovation and saying you have to fail quickly. And I don't like that phrase. I think you have to learn. And, and these cycles of learning are powerful because usually it's these small bets. You make a small bet. I want to ask somebody some questions. Oh, I'm going to learn something from that. Oh, I might try something in the marketplace. Oh, it didn't work. But in some cases, by trying it, you'll learn about a use or application that you never would have considered on your own. And so that those cycles of learning are just so important.
Yeah. And people see the world differently. Again, a lot of times when we're looking at attracting younger people into manufacturing that were born with cell phones in their hands and understand technology at a level that's different than the rest of us. They see the world differently. And for us to be able to learn from each other, just like we need to keep the history of the company and the skills and the expertise that the silver tsunami is leaving behind as they continue to retire. But that knowledge transfer of the people who are seeing the world differently and will make the innovations that we need for the future to go forward too.
Yeah, I love that, the silver tsunami. I don't think I've heard that, but I love hearing that. I'll add that there are two words that work together that I don't know if you hadn't thought of before, and that's the words tradition and discovery. And you've got the tradition, if you will, in the best sense, of all these people who've been around for decades. You also have a tradition of the upcoming and rising generation. And if you can meld those two traditions, the discovery potential is there. And I'm going to be quick to add, I never tell companies I work with that I'm going to guarantee them that they're going to make a big splash in innovation. But I guarantee them they're going to learn whether there's something out there to either act on or to defend themselves against. And that goes back to this option and insurance view of the world. Because if somebody comes in selling you innovation and they don't guarantee that, there's a problem. Those are two really big aspects of this.
As we're getting to the end of our time together, you gave so much information as far as innovation. And if somebody listening is, you know what, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what would be my products or processes, which would be the best for me to look at to see how I can innovate. So what would be your best suggestion to just get started with something new like that?
Yeah, and maybe this is going to sound too much like a consultant, but I like to start with an assessment, and it can start with a very informal. I do phone calls with people on a regular basis and confidential call, and just to begin to discuss what their situation is. I do formal assessments where I sit with the company or their leadership team, or even in some cases with a function of people. I did this with an engineering group and did an assessment of their ability to innovate and found out where were the hangups and where were the efficiencies. And then from there, I work with companies to advise and guide them. I lead them through workshops. I really act as an advisor to really owners, presidents, and management team for the most part, but also the innovators that we spoke about earlier. And so these are all ways to deal with it. But I think starting with the phone call, and people can reach me on LinkedIn. It's Bruce Vojak, Vojak. I also have a website for my consulting work that's breakthrough-innovation-advisors.com, and that's hyphenated. So it's breakthrough-innovation-advisors.com. And reach out and let's schedule a Zoom call and see if there's a fit for the needs of the company or the concerns.
Hey, Bruce, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show today. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's great to meet you, Lisa. Can't thank you enough.
I'm Lisa Ryan, and this is the Manufacturers Network podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Manufacturers Network podcast. If this conversation gave you something to think about, share it with someone else who will get it. And hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next.